And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the first webinar of 2021 for the review of political economy. Before we begin, perhaps I should put my my mask on. There you go. What would Keynes do? Or in this case, what would Furtado do? I should have had a special mask done for the today. My name is Louis-Philippe Rochon. I am the current editor-in-chief of the Review of Political Economy. ROPE is now in its 33rd year of publication. Today's webinar is based on a series of articles that are in the current issue of the journal, and the whole journal, the whole issue is on development economics, and it was guest edited by Natalia Bracarenz from the North Central College in the United States. I was approached maybe 3-4 months ago by Alfredo Saad-Filho, who had asked me if I would be interested in publishing a couple of previously unpublished papers by Furtado, and I immediately said yes and invited him and his co-authors, Pedro, Loureiro, and Fernando, Rugitsky, to write an accompanying introduction. And this forms a 3-paper part of the special symposium. So today's webinar is called Celso Furtado and the Myth of Economic Development, Rethinking Development from Exile. We have 3 speakers. In order of speaking, Alfredo Saad-Filho from King's College in the UK, Pedro Loureiro from the University of Cambridge in the UK, and finally Fernando Rugitsky from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. The total presentation should be about 45 to an hour minutes, and at which point we'll take some questions, and I'll have instructions on how you can ask questions. I'm sure you're familiar with that now. Until then, please, I remind you to remain muted and until the question period. So now I pass the camera, the video, to Alfredo.
Thank you very much, Louis-Philippe. We're very glad to be here. As Louis-Philippe mentioned, we had the privilege of publishing in the last issue of ROPE, with Louis-Philippe's support, an introduction and 2 working papers written by Celso Furtado, who was probably the most influential Brazilian economist of all time. And we owe the finding of these 2 working papers to Pedro, who will be speaking in a moment. And Pedro located these working papers at the library at the University of Cambridge, which is where Celso Furtado spent some time in the 1950s and then again in the 1970s. And it was in the second period that he wrote these 2 papers. And Pedro will tell us the story about the working papers later on. It may or may not involve a raid in the middle of the night. It may or may not involve abseiling from a great height. Maybe there's a little bit of sword fighting there, anything to get hold of the manuscripts. But Pedro is a very modest person, and he may not tell us that bit of the story, but I know the truth. What I can tell you in this meeting is that in the introduction and in the working papers, and the 2 working papers that are very interesting, even without the sword fight, and they are interesting because I think not many people in the world have had the chance to read those papers, and they were written by someone who is a very original thinker and a very influential thinker coming from the periphery and presenting very reflective, very thoughtful analyses of development and the situation of developing countries in the 1970s and the prospects for development at that point in time. Now, I'll give you a little bit of background, and then Pedro will talk about the content of the papers, and Fernando will contextualize Celso Furtado's work and his contribution in the light of modern macroeconomics. Now, Celso Furtado was born in 1920 and he died in 2004. So we are particularly happy and we feel very privileged to be publishing these texts in time to celebrate 100 years of his birth. And Furtado was very much a man of his time, and his economic thinking cannot be separated from the context in which he lived and the problems that he was trying to address. And in my view, the fundamental question that cuts across his work is the national question. The problem is, how do you build a nation? Of course, he's doing this from an economic point of view, but specifically, how do you build a nation of citizens in the periphery? Now, bear in mind the circumstances then. Furtado is speaking from a Latin American country that alongside the other countries in the region, mostly, became independent in the 19th century. So when Furtado is writing, when he's doing his politics, he was very much a political man. Brazil already had more than 100 years of existence as an independent nation with its own political system, with its own state institutions, accountability mechanisms, and so on. It may or may not work well, but they were there. Now, until the early 20th century, again, along with the other Latin American countries, the Brazilian economy was relatively simple, based on a model of growth, drawing on the export of primary products, in the case of Brazil, especially coffee. And Furtado, throughout his work, has got a lot to say about that particular model of growth and about its strengths and weaknesses in general, and about coffee in the model of development based on coffee exports in particular. Now, in this historical universe, Brazil had peculiarities, and that helps to explain where Furtado was coming from. First of all, it's evident that Brazil is a very large country in the Latin American context, and it also gained a dominant position in the global coffee market, peaking maybe slightly above 70% of the global market in the first years of the 20th century. And this would create a lot of potential for growth in the country. It would also pose very significant problems for the development of the country. And a lot of Furtado's work is dealing with these ambiguities. Now, and at the same time, through processes that Furtado would explore in his work, by the late 19th century, Brazil had already started a process of industrialization through import substitution. And this started relatively slowly, but it would imply a very significant shift in the economic structure of the country. And Furtado points out that import substitution in Brazil was poorly coordinated, it was shallow, it was volatile, and it was very closely articulated with something that Celso Furtado was very worried about, which is the absolutely horrendous social exclusion in Brazil and the tremendous concentration of income and wealth in the country. And this would be the outcome of centuries of history in the country, and it would have implications for its potential as a nation. And these implications reverberate until today. So part of the problem for Furtado is that from an economic point of view, Brazil is changing very rapidly. But if you look at the same problem from a social and distributional perspective, Brazil is not changing at all. And this tension is very important to Furtado, and he thinks that this tension has to be addressed. And this was similar across Latin America, but Brazil was larger. It was a very influential country. And import substitution in Brazil would go deeper. It had started earlier. It would achieve greater success than anywhere else in the region for reasons that Furtado examines in his work. Now, in the years between 1950s to the 1970s, when Furtado was at his most creative and most influential, that was also of course, the period of the Cold War. It was the age of decolonization, the age of state formation in Africa and Asia. So you have global rivalries, you have large movements of the left, you have nationalist governments emerging, you have nation states coming into existence. They are all looking for space to grow. And some of those nations and governments would look at the Latin American experience, the region in the global south that had become independent first of all. What can I do today in the light of that experience? And Furtado will have that context in mind. So even when he is discussing problems that are defined narrowly around Brazilian circumstances, he is also thinking about the world. Now, a man of his time. Furtado was a lawyer by training, but he got a PhD in economics at the Sorbonne in 1948. Then he goes to work at the brand new Economic Commission for Latin America of the United Nations that was and continues to be based in Santiago in Chile. And then under the leadership of the Argentine economist Raul Prebisch, who was the main founder of ECLA. And Furtado was very close to Prebisch. They became the core of a reasonably large organization that was leading the effort to advance a Latin American, genuinely Latin American perspective on economic development around an approach that would develop and would become known as structuralism. And the problem for ECLA was the scope for economic development in the region, by extension, the scope for economic development around the global, what we now call the global south, the global periphery, and then the scope for global convergence. And in particular, they were worried about the question of the national project in Latin America, meaning how to build those nations while also building democratic and reasonably equal societies. What can you do as an economist to contribute to that process? And so their structuralism is interesting in itself. It's also interesting as part of the global emergence of something that we would now call the rise of development economics in the post-war era. And structuralism is also interesting because it was the first school of economic thought, perhaps the first school of all social thought in the social sciences, the first school of thought to emerge in the periphery. It's an absolutely remarkable phenomenon. Now, if we take the narrow historical view, of course, structuralism failed, ECLA perspective failed, but they fought the good fight. And their work was incredibly influential back then. And it continues to be very influential today, and it echoes across successive generations of economists in Latin America, and it echoes in the policies, for example, of the pink tide administrations across the region in the last decade. At a personal level, in 1957, Furtado accepts an invitation from Caldor to go to Cambridge and spend a year there, and it was during that year that Furtado wrote what would become his most famous book, called The Economic Growth of Brazil. The book was published in 1959, and it is even now a basic textbook in Brazilian universities. Furtado then returns to Brazil. He was invited by the president of the country to take up the chairmanship of a regional development agency in the northeast of Brazil, the poorest region in the country. Furtado was from there. And then in 1962 and 63, he serves as Minister of Planning in the left populist administration of President João Goulart. Furtado was not very fortunate. He was not very successful. The country was paralyzed by an economic crisis. And then the year after he leaves the administration, the government was overthrown by a military coup. And Furtado, being a very prominent intellectual, he was right at the top of the list of people to be persecuted by the military government. He then decides to leave Brazil, and he would spend many years in exile in Chile and in the United States, and then in France. Furtado comes back to Brazil in the early 1980s. He joins the National Campaign for Democracy, which was successful in 1985. The first democratic administration then invites him to become Minister of Culture, which he does. He serves in other capacities as well, and he continues to debate economic policy and development policy right until he dies in 2004. Across Latin America, Celso Furtado is a well-known name. He has a very strong reputation. His work is widely recognized, and his life is even now a source of inspiration for all heterodox economists. Now, just to wrap up, most introductions to Furtado's thought begin with his most famous book, The Economic Growth of Brazil. What we're suggesting in our introduction is that the two working papers that are included in the latest issue of Rope, they offer an alternative entry point into Furtado's thought because they show a different aspect of his thinking. What they give us is a much broader, much more interdisciplinary critique of development and underdevelopment, with very close connections to dependency theory that was also very influential at that time. And the working papers will also serve, not just as reflection, but also serve as the basis for 4 books that Furtado would publish in quick succession in the following years. And it becomes easier to understand those books in the light of those 2 working papers. So that's it for me. I will pass you on to Pedro to talk about the content of the papers. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Pedro, you are up next.
Thanks very much. So let me begin by thanking Louis-Philippe, who very kindly, very particularly organized not only the publication of these working papers, but also today's event. I also have to thank 3 people in particular here. Julie Coimbra, our librarian at the Center of Latin American Studies at CLAS, Maria Lucia Palhares Burke, also a colleague at Cambridge who participated in finding and discussing these works, and finally, Rosa Freire da Guiar, Celso Furtado's widow, who played a fundamental role in making all of this happen. And we have been chatting a lot about Furtado's life, these works, and so on. So thanks very much indeed to all of them. Okay, so I will talk about 3 things here. I'll discuss briefly the process of finding the working papers, which I'm afraid that differently from what Alfredo suggested isn't exactly that exciting, but still there's one thing or another to be said. I'll contextualize a bit the writing of these working papers in terms of Furtado's stays in Cambridge. And finally, I will highlight what I believe to be the main features of the working papers before passing on to Fernando, who will discuss their contemporary relevance. So finding the working papers, this was sometime in May, I believe, last year. So the initial moments of the pandemic, if you like, full of admin work, concerned about pretty much everything. And our librarian, Julie, sent me an email saying, Pedro, we should write a note about Furtado's centenary this year. So, well, yes, sure, let's do that. And she dropped sort of an offhand comment saying, and by the way, we've got these working papers here. Do you know that he wrote 2 working papers whilst he was here? I said, oh, no, Julie, I didn't know about that. Did they come out? No, they're unpublished. So, well, we've got small treasure in our hands here, and we have to do something about that. And then a couple of backs and forths and deciding what were these papers, what were the context in which they were produced, etc. Had read. And it turns out that these working papers were later heavily edited and became 2 chapters in a book that shares a similar name, The Myth of Economic Development. There are substantive differences between the working papers and these chapters. We discuss many of them in the accompanying piece that came out in Rope. And in particular, I find that these are much more trenchant, poignant critiques of development that show Celso Furtado in a moment of enlarging his thought, of enlarging the scope of his reflections. And he has some really great passages that would later not show in the final version of this book that came out in Portuguese. These are also some of the few texts that Furtado wrote originally in English, which is a source of interest in and of itself. And some of the more specific theoretical formulations that he proposes there about underdevelopment, about the connection between underdevelopment and dependence, and about the relationship between growth, structural change, and distribution, between production and circulation, are different as well. Fernando will comment a bit on this, so I won't go too much into these details now. But they're very interesting pieces in and of themselves. They remain contemporary, to an extent, I'd say more contemporary than some of his more well-known or better known pieces, such as The Economic Growth of Brazil. And for those interested in the evolution of Furtado's thought, they're also very pregnant with ideas that would later on be developed, edited, and so on. Basically, have a read, access the papers, read them. I think that's the best you can get out of this session. But let me carry on. So Furtado had these two periods in Cambridge that Alfredo mentioned. And in his biography, he writes that the University of Cambridge, since the 1950s, when he first went to Cambridge, had always been a fundamental point of reference in his life. Cambridge has both a fiercely parochial nature to it. Sometimes it can be suffocating in its provincianism, but it's also, of course, a global place for the discussion of ideas, for the circulation of people, and the encounter of different traditions, cultures, modes of thinking, etc. And I think that Furtado's two stays there relate to these two aspects of Cambridge in a way. The first time he goes there, when he ends up writing The Economic Growth of Brazil, at the invitation of Caldor, he has very appreciative comments of Cambridge that you can read in his biography. He talks about Cambridge's beauty, the quaintness of the place, of drinking lots of wine in King's College with the fellows and so on. You can see him really basking in this atmosphere of the exotic, but also of the very productive, interesting, and intellectually stimulating place that Cambridge was and is. And this is when he discusses with some of the most prominent, interesting minds in economics at the time, John Robinson, Caldor, Sraffa, Amartya Sen. There's a very productive moment of the Faculty of Economics in Cambridge, perhaps its peak. And not only that, but this opens the door to a UNESCO-sponsored seminar between economists working at either side of the so-called Iron Curtain, which he finds very interesting. He talks about economic planning with them. He sees different ways of approaching planning. He talks about the Latin American approach to planning. So this is a big moment of enlarging his reflections, of being in contact with these other minds and contributing to the discussions that were happening at that time as well. And he arrives to Cambridge with the idea of studying high theory. He mentions that I had to dedicate my time to high theory then. But he comes full circle in doing that. And what I find particularly interesting about this is, perhaps this is somewhat of his rationalization of things, but he writes that it was by looking into the student union at Cambridge, the debates that were held there, that changed his mind about dedicating himself to high theory or to practical problems. And he arrives at this by saying that those who formulate the questions economists are called to answer determine their theoretical field. And then he says that following the genuine autonomy of universities that could be found in the student union, he became convinced that theoretical work in the social sciences is, to an extent, a prolongation of politics. And this makes him value politics more. And he says, I became convinced that there were two outstanding tasks in Brazil. First, to complete the process of industrialization, and second, to forestall growing regional inequalities in the country. And as a man from the northeast of the country, he should dedicate himself to the second task. So he should go back to Brazil and not dedicate himself primarily to high theory, but to act upon development in the country. So he arrives at Cambridge, he's reinvigorated by moments of discussing high theory, but he concludes that his role was the role of the theoretically informed politician, someone who understands theory, but puts that to the service of development itself. I think this highlights a very strong aspect of Celso Furtado's life as both a cosmopolitan and someone who was clearly attentive to and acting upon locally relevant issues. Then Alfredo detailed a bit what happened after that. Fast forward to his second stay in Brazil. Dictatorships throughout Latin America, the fall of Allende, a period of reckoning with failures of the left, broadly speaking, a moment of disenchantment. And Cambridge for him assumes much more this parochial character that it has. So instead of commenting positively on the walks that he had, on the people that he met, on how fun and engaging it was to drink wine and play sports with old fellows during Christmas, what he writes in his diaries is something along the following lines. So I'm quoting an entry here of 1974. He says, "I ramble through these lofty fantasy gardens. And is it skepticism that comes with age or a subtle fatigue? With every day that passes, I think more about the uselessness, or rather the insignificance of all that I've done. All the myths in which I believed, can anyone believe in anything beyond myths? And are they myths once we believe in them?" And he carries on to say, "How sick am I with politics after all that I came to know about Chile? A group of delirious intellectuals and suicidal youths joyfully jeopardize all that the people had amassed with sweat, blood, and tears for many years. To what extent did vanity play a role in all that Allende did?" So you can see him with deep anguish when he is in Cambridge, considering what it was, this project that he was a major actor in attempting to develop Latin America, and considering what happened with all of this. And it is from this position of pessimism, of having to reimagine development, that these contributions of his come, these two working papers. And I think these elements animate what he did there and will continue to be a driving force of the 4 books that he publishes over the next decade. But his pessimism doesn't lead him by any means to nihilism or to stagnation or stalemate. Actually, he doubles down on a bet on the agency of people in the third world to reimagine development. And I think this is what comes through, this is what shines through very clearly in the 2 working papers. So, but the working papers and these 4 books that come later, of which I believe Accumulation and Development, the Logic of Industrial Civilization, is the most interesting, most innovative one. The translation isn't the best of the title. The closest translation to the Portuguese original would have been Creativity and Dependence in Industrial Civilization. But there are 4 main things that come out of these 2 working papers: a focus on the environment, or the environmental limits to growth at a very, very early stage, although motivated by the Club of Rome's report. Greater engagement with multinational corporations, the role that they play in development, in constraining and enabling possibilities of development, although this had begun a bit earlier. A wider scope of his reflections. Furtado had never been, let's say, constrained, a narrow-minded economist, but this is really a moment of widening the scope of his reflections. And the key element here, with, at least in our reading, is a deeper attention paid to culture in an approach that continues to be grounded in political economy. So I'll highlight a bit pessimism and culture. I won't go too much into the environmental issues and the multinational corporations here, but we do broach the subject in our accompanying piece. So to begin with the wider scope, Furtado writes in his biographies that his objective when writing these working papers and later on the books that came out of them, my objective was to develop a common language for the several branches of the social sciences, allowing development to be apprehended as the fulfillment of human potentialities in the plural. Of course, this is a rather lofty goal. One doesn't get much broader than this. And as we argue in the paper, now I'll mention a bit here, he did make good contributions towards this cause. And as an aside, this invites a clear dialogue with Amartya Sen, with whom he had contact, regular contact when he was in Cambridge, with the capabilities approach of Amartya Sen. His definition of development as the fulfillment of human potentialities, he invites a clear dialogue with Amartya Sen, which hasn't, to my knowledge, been developed yet. So for our young researchers out there, that might be a good research project. Anyways, pessimism with development. I've already mentioned the general tone of pessimism that he had at that point, but let's see how it shines through in his work. The first thing is, of course, this notion that gives a title to one of the working papers, that economic development was a myth. And he says that by myth, he means the implicit idea that economic development, such as has been practiced in the countries that led the Industrial Revolution, I believe this is an important bit to bracket, can be universalized, or more precisely, that the standards of consumption presently enjoyed by the population of the industrialized countries could be shared by the masses of population in the third world, provided that they work hard and behave well. So there's a clear jab at Rostow here, with provided that they work hard and behave well. And this jaunty, trenchant language is not something that survives into the later book. Furtado tones down a bit his analysis, a bit more conventional in his choice of words, but it really shines through in these pages. So myth, in the sense, is not just an illusion, although it has this character of illusion of impossibility, but it's also the meta-narrative that holds the system together, that works as the spirit that drives people to work hard and behave well, that constrains possibilities in the third world. So myth in this double sense of something that guides, but that is not reachable. And then he goes on to say that it has now been clearly established that the countries of the third world will never be developed, if we mean by this to have access to the standard of living of the developed countries of today. So he's saying two things in this. One, that development as it existed, as it was proposed, as the myth that existed back then, was not realizable by third world countries. But he's also saying a different thing that comes together with it, that development can and should be reimagined. That's why I bracketed these notions of such as has been practiced in the countries that led the Industrial Revolution. And that's why we cannot find in Furtado here resignation to underdevelopment, but rather, and this brings us to the point of culture, a proposal to reimagine what development might be, what development can mean as this fulfillment of human potentialities. So here, I'll now return to this in a second, but we need to briefly touch upon what he meant by culture, or an integration of culture into what he was doing in these working papers. For him, culture comes in both as a direct determinant of economic trajectories. So he says that dependence, as it was developing back then, was growingly becoming cultural dependence with economic impacts. And this meant both a mimicking of consumption patterns developed in rich countries by the elites of third world countries, and the technological dependence that ensues from that. So economic dependency was being predicated upon an ongoing cultural dependence that was developing. And the solution that he proposes to that is that people in the third world had to develop new forms of rationality. So not just ways of doing things more efficiently, not just the means-orientated rationality that is typical of one element of what Weber discusses, the standard, let's say, neoclassical view of efficiency. Not just this form of rationality, but rationality in reimagining values, in creating new notions of what development should mean. And in doing that, he proposes that development is inseparable from this creative reimagining of what it is from the periphery. So as a counterpoint to pessimism, he doubles down on his commitment to democracy, on his commitment to popular participation. So he becomes much more of a radical person committed to emancipation with the agency of those who had been oppressed, those who were in situations of dependency. Although in terms of his, let's say, party political affiliations, this doesn't quite translate into how he read Allende, given the quote that I mentioned earlier. But in the way that he writes, he really posits, he really puts the weight of reimagining development, not on an intelligentsia, not on intellectuals, but on the masses of the third world to reimagine what that will be. And there's a quote that also does not appear in the book later on, but at least not in the same way, that is very representative of this. And he says, for the masses of the third world, the predicament is to stay where they are, while small minorities in their respective countries share le douceur of the modern way of life. And here's where the bite comes, as long as they are not prepared to build for themselves a different destiny. So this notion that against pessimism, he doubles down on democracy, on emancipation, on a self-construction of a different destiny. And in doing that, he also says that the masses of the third world will be able to build a form of capitalism. He was never a revolutionary, a communist, but a form of capitalism that would be much less unequal than that which existed in developed countries back then. And this is also a very innovative moment of Furtado. This is something that really does not appear in Latin American structuralism, which is proposing that the third world, that underdeveloped countries, would be able to show the way forward for the world as a whole. So he breaks away with a certain tradition of romanticizing developed countries that exists in a lot of Latin American structuralism, of assuming that capitalism worked well in developed countries and all that was needed was a series of difficult structural reforms in order to reach that level. Differently from that, Furtado says that it is up to the third world to show a different form of capitalism that would be better not only for underdeveloped countries, but for the world as a whole. So in doing that, he's proposing that development has to be thought again, has to be reimagined from the periphery. And to conclude and pass on to Fernando, this more radical view of Furtado, this Furtado that is critical of standard notions of development, is perhaps a Furtado that disappeared from view a bit during the pink tide government. He was brought back to scene. There are frequent mentions to his thought in many of the policymakers of the left-wing governments of Latin America of the past few decades, but much more the older Furtado that was about how to complete industrialization, not the Furtado that was about how to reimagine development. So this is an aspect of Furtado that is very present in these working papers, and then we try to highlight in our presentation here. And perhaps this is, using Furtado's words, something that can be explained. So when Furtado said that those who formulate the questions economists are called to answer determine the theoretical field of economists, perhaps this is something that happened during the pink tide government. And moving forward in a period of rebuilding of progressive possibilities in Latin America and throughout the world, the Furtado that we should revisit, the Furtado that offers us greater opportunities to imagine the future, is the Furtado that is present in these two working papers. Now I'll leave it at that and pass it on to Fernando.
Thank you very much, Fernando. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Thank you very much, Luis Felipe. Let me begin by thanking Luis Felipe again for both supporting our effort to publish these two working papers and organizing this session. It's a great pleasure to be here sharing our thoughts on Furtado with all of you, and sharing this session with friends and colleagues who also study Furtado closely. I'm glad to see all of you here today. So let me try to do the following in my time shortly, so that we can open the floor to a broader conversation and dialogue. Contra Furtado and the passage that Pedro has read from his diary, in which in 1973 or 1974 in Cambridge, he was questioning the relevance of all he had done. My attempt today is to precisely to suggest how relevant is this particular Furtado for a critical understanding of the contemporary capitalist societies, both North and South, especially South, but I'll come to that in a moment. As Pedro already emphasized in the end of his talk, our provocation in this paper, in this introduction that we wrote, is to suggest that this radical Furtado from the 1970s is, for unfortunate reasons, the most relevant to contemporary capitalism. He was, his reflections from the 1970s was a product of defeat, of historical defeat of the left, of rising dictatorship, of grappling with dictatorship in Brazil and his exile, of grappling with the failure of Allende's government in Chile. And unfortunately, almost half a century later, we are also in a moment of rethinking our formulations in light of historical defeat, not only in Brazil, but with the rise of the far right across the world. So very briefly, what I aim to do in this talk is to suggest Furtado's contemporary relevance, specifically the contemporary relevance of these two working papers in two areas. The literature on post-development, very briefly, and more more detailed, the issue of structural dynamics. So to begin with the issue of post-development, this connects very clearly with all that Pedro has mentioned on Furtado attributing the agency of rethinking development to the masses of the third world, as he called them. It's interesting to read this contribution of Furtado in light of the later literature on post-development. Renata Bianconi, who is here with us today, has written much more extensively on that topic than we did. But let me give you a brief summary of our points in this regard. So in a recent assessment by ZI, published in Third World Quarterly on the post-development literature, he discusses the merits and the limits of this literature that has questioned that has criticized the political role that the development literature has performed by constraining the horizon, by imposing a deepening of the domination of the explored majority of the third world in light of elusive objective. This literature has been summarized recently in this paper by Ziai, saying that it can mostly be divided in two strands. One of these strands is the progressive one, if I may, a radical democratic position, in the words of Ziai, which holds a constructivist concept of culture and aims to reimagine development from the bottom up, if I may. The other strand of the post-development literature is a strand which is, if we could suggest, backward-looking, which holds an essentialist affirmation of traditional cultures and a paternalistic approach to the poor. These are all expressions by this from this paper by Ziai. What this division suggests is that Furtado was writing much before most of this literature came forward, and he anticipates the most fruitful aspects of that, both in his questioning of development as a myth. He mentions specifically how development has been used to destroy traditional cultures and traditional ways of life, to destroy the environment, and to hold together the domination of the masses of the third world. But also, as Pedro has emphasized, suggests that development should not be just thrown away, but should be rethought from the bottom up, from as an attempt of the masses of the third world to rethink their destiny. So Furtado anticipates the best strand of the post-development literature by his close interconnection of development and democracy, and his suggestion against the technocratic inclinations of even a lot of heterodox economists and progressive economists, that development has to be rethought from the standpoint of radical democracy in the global south. So that's very briefly a suggestion that this recent post-development literature could benefit from Furtado. Let me be a bit more specific on the issue of structural dynamics. So to explain what I mean by structural dynamics, and specifically Furtado's contribution to structural dynamics, it's useful to go back to his work from the mid-1960s. So that's when Furtado begins to show his pessimism on the possibilities of overcoming underdevelopment, and his diagnosis of the mechanisms which allowed for the continuous reproduction of underdevelopment. So in his work from the mid-1960s, specifically his work on what he called the stagnationist tendencies of the underdeveloped countries, he's mostly making a case against the more standard development model formulated by Arthur Lewis in 1954 in his seminal paper, The Economic Development with Unlimited Supplies of Labor. In Lewis's argument, development would be represented as a cumulative process between capital accumulation and absorption of labor surplus. So Lewis formulates this model with two sectors, capitalist sector and a subsistence sector. The subsistence sector would hold this stock of surplus labor, and development would be represented specifically by the migration of labor from the subsistence to the capitalist sector, which would gain speed cumulatively with capital accumulation, reaching eventually a turning point in which surplus labor would have been absorbed in its entirety, and then previously increased inequality would start to fall down, and the country could be considered having reached a developed status. In 1965, as actually a broader trend of skepticism about the prospects of this process of development, Furtado claims that you have to introduce sectoral heterogeneity to understand the limits of Lewis's model. So what he claims is that the capitalist sector cannot be thought as a single sector, but has to be divided in its different segments. Some of them more capital intensive, and some of them more labor intensive. And in his understanding, there will be a cumulative process between the structures of demand and the structures of supply throughout the process of development, in which the structure of demand, determined in itself by income inequality and by actually the cultural dimension of consumption patterns, this structure of demand would shift the structure of supply, actually the direction of development of the capitalist sector towards certain sectors. In the period he was writing, he was suggesting that a specifically dualistic consumption pattern created by very unequal income distribution in Brazil and in other Latin American countries would lead the capitalist sector to grow towards capital intensive sectors, which would decelerate the absorption of labor by the capitalist sector and would thus reproduce surplus labor. In this way, you would have this cumulative process between the structure of demand and structure of supply, which would not continuously in an accelerated way absorb labor from the subsistence sector, but it would reproduce continuously surplus labor and reproduce continuously development. In his take in the 1960s, this would lead to stagnation eventually. What happened is that Furtado formulated this idea about stagnation just before one of the most rapid growth spurts that happened in the Brazilian economy, the so-called Brazilian economic miracle. So in 1974, in one of the working papers that we're talking about, that we've just published, he has to rethink his understanding of the cumulative process between demand and supply, but he rethinks it without abandoning the framework as a whole. And even his most famous critics, there's this famous paper by Maria da Conceição Tavares and José Serra, which question his 1965 approach. Even his critics hold to this approach of a cumulative process between the structure of demand and structure of supply, something that would be later called by Aníbal Pinto a style of development. So very briefly, what he does in 1974 is saying, okay, you can have growth independently of the continuous reproduction of surplus labor and the continued increasing of income inequality, but this structural dynamics of rising inequality leading to more and more capital intensive sectors go on, and this reproduces underdevelopment even with accelerated growth. In his words in 1974 in the working paper, he says accelerated growth increases rather than diminishes internal and external dependence, internal and external exploitation. So this approach of this structural dynamics, of this style of development, as Aníbal Pinto would call it, is in our understanding very contemporary for several reasons. First, if we think specifically on the realities of Latin America, or specifically South America during the commodities boom and the pink tide governments in the early 21st century, what we saw in this period was structural dynamics that is different from the one that Furtado was diagnosing in 1970s. What we saw is that falling wage inequality, even if in a limited way, falling wage inequality promoted by rising minimum wages and rising social transfers led to a shifting structure of supply towards sectors that were less capital intensive, towards basic services, towards construction, and in detriment of more technological intensive, capital intensive manufacturing sectors. So this interaction between the structure of demand and structure of supply in this more recent period led to a cumulative process that connected productive regression or regressive specialization, a regression of the productive structure with falling wage inequality. The difference from Furtado's time is that what we see today is that we have a continuous reproduction of underdevelopment, of structural dependence, of external dependence, with falling wage inequality, even if in a limited way, and accelerated growth. So his pessimism from the 1970s is still very relevant, even if the scenario changed. But we can only understand, in our view, the full significance of the development experience of South American countries during the pink tide period if we look at this structural dynamics and understand how falling wage inequality was connected to regressive specialization. A lot of critical discourses on this development experience has emphasized that there was an attempt to change the structure of demand, but a lack of attempt to change the structure of supply. In our view, this is mistaken. Actually, structure of demand and structure of supply interact and interfere with each other, and they have to be thought as something endogenous to each other. And last, I know I've already used the time I was supposed to. And last, we would like to suggest that this formulation by Furtado on structural dynamics is not only relevant to the global South and to South America in particular, but seems to be particularly relevant to the global North as well. Recently, it used to be the case that the literature on development focused on the global South would incorporate sectoral heterogeneity because these countries would be very sectorally very heterogeneous, while the global North would be more homogeneous sectorally. So single commodity models would be enough to take care of macro dynamics, to grasp with macro dynamics of the global North. But recently, we have several scholars emphasizing how the US economy in particular is becoming more and more dualistic, presenting features of sectoral heterogeneity that were common to only the global South in earlier periods. Specifically, there's a recent book by Peter Temming in which he recovers the Lewis model in particular, and more specifically, a recent book by Lance Taylor and Ozan Omer makes the case specifically that structural dynamics as the one that Furtado formulated and that we've been discussing is crucial to understand wage stagnation and rising inequality in the United States. So this way that Furtado formulated, which is able to connect structural dynamic, structure of demand, structure of supply, income distribution, capital accumulation, and in its way, the transformation of the class structure, so connects as well politics and economics, seems to be still very relevant to thinking about the limits of development in the global South, and increasingly about the political polarization and economic polarization shown in the global North. So, and for unfortunate reasons, as I mentioned before, the more optimistic Furtado from the 1950s, which is generally brought forward by developmentalist economists, seems to be not as relevant and not as useful to contemporary world as this pessimistic Furtado from the 1970s, this Furtado who was radicalized by historical defeat. That's it. I've already talked too much. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope we have a fruitful dialogue from now on.
Thank you, Fernando. We're going to thank you to all three of you, by the way. I'd like to remind Fernando that where I am, it is minus 10 degrees right now. I see you in your shirt outside. Okay, we're going to proceed to some questions. And in order to ask questions, if you look in your chat box, you will see, I think that's where the hand is, a hand that you can click and your name will appear with a hand next to it, like Eric just did. Thank you, Eric. Before I go to Eric, though, I do want to say a few things. First of all, you mentioned Peter Temin. We were very honored to have him at our university last year. Gave an amazing talk, an amazing individual. But I do have a question for any of the three. I think it was maybe Alfredo who mentioned Joan Robinson. I can't remember. Do you have any more information about the relationship between Furtado and Robinson, and if anyone has written on that relationship? Thank you. Any of you can answer.
That was
Do you want to
Pedro.
collect questions or?
No, well, let's just go one-on-one. I think it's more better like that.
Okay, I can say something briefly about that question. I don't know whether there's a lot written about that relationship. There might be, and others, including some in the audience, might be better able to address that. But in his diaries, Furtado does mention meeting Joan Robinson very regularly and discussing a lot of things with her. His impression is that she was becoming too abstract. And so he said something along the following lines. I haven't got the book here with me to quote, but I'm pretty sure it's along the following lines, that she would rail against mathematical formalism, but she would write in an English that was so abstruse that it was harder to comprehend than any mathematical formulation. And she'd often give him texts to read, but they were so abstract that he would either accept or reject them in whole and not have that much to discuss. But he has also got some very appreciative remarks of the discussions that he held with her. But I can't remember or do not know too much about the substantive content that went into those discussions. But perhaps someone else has more to say.
Thank you. Fernando Ferrari Filo, I just want to, before I go to Fernando Rugitsky, he mentions that it would be interesting also to talk about the relationship between Furtado and Caldor. So, okay, Fernando Rugitsky, you had a comment?
Yeah, very briefly. I think it should be made clear that in general, regarding Furtado's relation to the Cambridge Keynesians, is that Furtado had in this, especially in the 1950s and the 1960s, hold supply-led macro model. So he wasn't thinking in terms of a demand-led macro model, which actually was in line with what Rugitsky himself thought was the useful model for underdeveloped countries, right? There's this famous paper by Rugitsky in which he says that demand is not the constraint to development, to growth in underdeveloped countries. It would take some more debates for further Brazilian developmentalist literature to react to Furtado and incorporate more fully the lessons of the Cambridge Keynesians and think about growth in demand-led terms. So Furtado, it's very interesting that he incorporates the structure of demand and this style of development that I mentioned in his works in the mid-1960s towards the 1970s. Then he shifts to culture and towards other directions, but he doesn't actually incorporate a demand-led model of growth. So he was probably influenced by his dialogue with the Cambridge Keynesians, but it can't be said that he brought their model to apply for the Latin American reality.
Well, if anyone wants to write a paper on Furtado and the Cambridge Keynesians, I would be very interested in publishing that. We'll go to the questions in order that they appear. Eric Kemp, then Claudia Romero, then my colleague David Ledbeater. So Eric?
Thank you. I think also Eduardo Suplicy was trying to raise his physical hand. So um, I don't know if it's on this point or another one.
About John Robinson and
Uh,
Celso Furtado. Well, John Robinson, together with John Maynard Keynes and James Edward Mead and several others, were very much in favor of a citizen's basic income. John Robinson argued that, well, she said that it would be a very good thing to give one sterling pound to everyone, to every citizen each Saturday. And well, John Maynard Keynes in How to Pay for the War also mentioned that England and the United Kingdom should be prepared for the war and should separate 2% of the GNP to pay a basic income to the people. And James Edward Mead in Agathotokia is brilliantly argues in favor of a basic income. Well, Celso Furtado, in January 8th, 2004, when he was teaching at the University of Sorbonne in Paris, on the day that President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva sanctioned the law 10.835, 2004, that institutes step by step, starting with those most in need, the citizens' basic income, universal and unconditional, he sent the following message to President Lula. At this moment in which Your Excellency sanctions the law of the citizens' basic income, I want to express that with this measure, our country starts to be in the vanguard of those who fight for the construction of a more solidarity society. Frequently, Brazil was referred as one of the last countries to abolish slavery. Now, with this act that is the fruit of civism and ample social vision of Senator Eduardo Suplicy, Brazil will be referred as the first one that institutes a system of solidarity so abundant that and that it was all also approved by the representatives of the people. I would like to tell you that I just got the news that the Public Defensory of the Union has just approved a determination that the executive Brazilian government must put into practice what was approved 17 years ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have a short statement. So I was looking at this through the lens of, I apply an ecological economics lens to structuralist development theory. And I looked at the paper of The Myth of Development, and I saw an ecological economics analysis at a global scale that was really quite forward-looking. So I would just add that as another way in which it foregrounds current debates and what my colleague Shivan Kartha calls the right to development in a climate-constrained world. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. Any comments?
May I?
Yes, please, Fernando.
So thank you, Senator. Thank you, Eric. Let me very briefly talk about the issue of the ecological constraint. it's very interesting, as Pedro mentioned in his opening exposition, that Furtado begins his argument about the myth of economic development by talking about the report by the on the limits of growth, right? And what I think it's interesting about his take on this report and his take on ecological limits to growth is that he was certainly aware of the issue from early on, so he was anticipating something that would be more widespread much later, but also that he claims that the report had a serious weakness, which was assuming that the consumption patterns of the developed world could be reproduced in the underdeveloped world for economic reasons, if not ecological reasons. And his whole argument is that this is naive, and that this consumption pattern would not be universalizable to the global south for economic reasons, for the mechanism that he suggested that would reproduce continuously under development. Which I think, what I think is sorry, very important is that it's not clear if he suggests for me in this working paper if the reproduction of underdevelopment would actually make the ecological constraints to growth less severe, because the global south would not develop and would not present these consumption patterns which put more of a burden on climate and on nature. But what I think it has to be stated is that even though we suggest that his argument about the continuous reproduction of underdevelopment is still relevant, consumption patterns have been much more diffused to the third world than he anticipated. The reduction of the cost of manufacturing production with the shift of manufacturing production to East Asia particularly has made a lot of manufacturing products available to the poorer sections in the third world. So even though underdevelopment is continuously reproduced, the lack of diffusion of consumption patterns should not be thought as something that would help in terms of ecological constraints, in contrast to what he seems implicitly to suggest.
Thank you. With my apologies, oh no, I guess she left. Okay, so we're going to go next to my colleague, David Ledbeater, who has to leave very soon, I'm guessing, because we have a departmental meeting to which I'll be late to.
Touche, thank you. I wanted to ask about a biographical issue and then also something that troubles me, and that is a subjective reaction of Furtado to the Chilean experience and the overthrow of Allende. I'm curious about his reaction, if there's any more that you found about how he viewed Chile's Allende's economics, in particular the nationalization of copper, or the issue of imperialism and economic rents in the development of Latin America. If he said anything explicit about that. The second thing is, while he was at Cambridge, Morris Dobb was still alive, and Dobb had written a great deal from a Marxist point of view about development and debates on the role of heavy industry and not only about the Soviet Union, but also about Africa. So I just wondered if he had any communications or dialogue with Morris Dobb. Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Fernando, you were looking a bit into how Furtado replied to Allende, weren't you? If you could take that up.
Okay, you keep talking, so you have to limit me. So very briefly, I'm not aware of a lot of other written reactions from Furtado regarding Chile's experience and Allende's fall. So I could not answer the issue of the nationalization of copper and these things. But what I think is interesting is that Furtado is consistently vocal against radicalization. So he saw himself as a moderate. So I think that was probably why he felt that the Allende government was going too fast and to radicalize in a direction that he might not be opposed in principle, but he would be like tactically hesitant to follow. What Pedro mentioned is that what I think is interesting. One of the other big economists from Brazil, Maria Conceição Tavares, which was in some sense a disciple of Furtado in the beginning, but was closer to Marxism. In a recent documentary, she had a very different reaction from his regarding Allende's fall. She claimed that she saw Allende's fall as her own defeat, different from the rise of the military dictatorship in Brazil, because the military dictatorship in Brazil defeated a government which was, according to her, confused. It was the left populist government of Jean Goulart that Alfredo and Pedro mentioned, but whose program was not exactly, I think, what she defended. But Allende's government was exactly what she defended, and so she saw it her own defeat. What I think it's interesting is that you have these very different reactions of Allende's fall from Furtado and from Conceição Tavares, but the reality of historical defeat and the lost illusions with the development prospects of Latin America kind of push them closer together in their approaches, and that connects to the other question on Dobb and Marxism. Furtado wrote a very interesting book in 1964, in the eve of the military coup in Brazil, very much focused on Marx and on Marxian. I don't think he quotes Dobb explicitly in his work. If I'm not mistaken, he doesn't. He mostly refers to Marx and Engels' own works. But I think that his main point, throughout his work, he always engaged with Marxism, but usually in a critical vein. And I think his main point regarding South America, Latin America, is that he claimed that because of surplus labor, class struggle would be attenuated or muted in Latin America. So class struggle could not be seen as the mover of historical development, because it was attenuated by the existence of surplus labor, which I think is a very problematic stance, but it's the way he reacted to Marxism in this book from 1964. I'm not aware, he probably has more direct engagements with Maurice Dobbs' work, but I'm not aware of that. If someone has some information, I would be very glad to know.
Thank you. We're going to take two more questions. The next one is by Amitava. Amitava?
Unmute. Yeah, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I was late in coming to the party, but I think I've heard some of it to know the what the main ideas of this. Furtado is somebody whose work I've admired for a long time, although some of it is probably not available in English. I find this paper that you have talked about, Fernando, hi, and some of the others. I find in it a very interesting connection with what can be called post-developmentalism, right? As you point out, and also looking back at what was wrong with let's call it development in the past. I think I'd like to learn more about this. So I want to ask what you saw, and I'll wait for the paper by Furtado also. It's not been published yet, right? Or
It has been published. It's in the current issue. I'll send
okay,
you
so
copies. I'll send you copies, Amitava.
okay. Um, what I'm very interested in is what we as so-called scholars of development ought to do. And I think the first thing to do is to be self-critical. And I think Furtado is an excellent example of this, which is we are, or some of us are, good at understanding the problems of development, uh, whatever that means. We are good at understanding the problems of capitalism, whatever that means, for everywhere, right? But I think we are too much part of the system and benefited it to be really self-critical. Uh, and even these questions about what connection did Furtado have with Robinson and Caldor, you know, forget about, you know, people who are in the middle of a capitalist world who have moments of maybe insight. Who cares what Caldor or Robinson said? Okay. Yet each one of them has something very important to contribute, I think. You know, so what I want to ask you is, did Furtado see a separation between his work before and how that would help to reimagine development, if you will? I think you mentioned even he wasn't willing to give up capitalism, but what does that mean anyway? Okay, and even this idea of giving money to the poor to lift them up doesn't leave out the question of what's development about? Is it about money? Is it about growth? Is it about equality of what? To make everybody rich or to make everybody poor? I think everybody should become poor in some sense. Anyway, so these are some pretty random thoughts about what I heard today.
Thank you, Amitava. The beard looks good. Um, anyone wants to take that? Comment on this?
I can say a few words on that. Brief comment on Allende. I know that in some places of Furtado's biography, he does comment on Allende in some more depth. I don't quite remember what he said, but I'm sure that he was in favor of the government. He was a supporter of the government, participated in meetings and planning moments to support the government. But is also rather critical of some of the economic policies in particular that they were taking. He wasn't too optimistic about centralization of some institutions there. He has something against, I don't know whether it's copper or whether it is something else that becomes nationalized there. He says it is a great space for experimentation, but they still needed to get the act together in terms of increasing productivity and things like that. So he was a major political supporter of Allende. He did have critiques when it came to the narrower economic policies, if you like. But I haven't got more details here. What I guess would be my, at least a thrust of an answer to you, Amitava, is that Furtado did not answer that himself. He doesn't put himself in the position of saying, here is the answer of what development should mean. His practice does relate to that closely. One element of that is looking into culture. It's looking into the need of developing new meanings for development that have to be more equal, that have to show a way forward for the world. But if you look into his political practice as well, he became the Minister of Culture in Brazil later on. He served in several capacities, as Alfredo said, but I think this is very indicative, very suggestive of where he thought that a future would lie. He'd not abandoned his, let's say, contributions as an economist, how he could contribute in that way, He was much more interested in fomenting the sort of broader societal change, or not even fomenting, but perhaps enabling, facilitating that sort of change than giving an objective, direct answer to what that would mean. I know this is, very sideways answer to what you're saying, but perhaps this has to do with the nature of the task as Furtado saw it. I don't know if someone else wants to comment.
Okay, then we will go to the last question by Carlos Mallorquin.
Good afternoon, I think. Thank you very much, Pedro and Fernando, for the paper. I just want to make a general comment on two issues or your formidable exposition, especially for younger readers of Furtado. On the one hand is the dangers of interpreting Furtado's writings of the 60s by his rationalizations. I mean, I generally think authors, and especially writers as Furtado, they lie. But so what? Everybody lies. So let's touch pessimism. Pessimism of Furtado has to be thought in terms of the period and the transitional nature of his thought. For example, in Prefacio, 2-3 years after those papers and those memories that you touch on, by Prefacio, Furtado even managed to say that Latin America structurally is on a diminishing returns pattern. But if you continue with reading the work of Furtado, you find a totally different transformation of that thesis, because creativity and introduction to development is really his most profound, arguments for a general theory within Latin American structuralism. So there is a step way forward in his future works from the 1976 onwards. That really cannot be understood by what he says on diminishing returns on structuralism. So we must be very careful not to use Furtado's later years rationalization of what he felt and what he wanted to do with what he wrote. So I just wanted to make sure that and I finish with this, and this is the mid-1970s, he's the profound dependency theorist. And that's why most of the readers today recover the mid-1970s Furtado, because it's a profound dependency theory. But I really believe, this is a very personal prejudice of mine, I really believe that Furtado immediately after Preface of Political Economy, he wanted to, get rid of most of the issues he developed in his pessimistic years, and he really wanted to make some distance with himself with dependency theory. He was always was an autonomous theoretical writer, and so he wanted to distance himself. So I just wanted to make comments of that general nature. Thank you anyway.
Thank you, Carlos. If anyone of you wants to comment on that, otherwise we are at the end. Do you have any last thoughts, last comments?
Very, very briefly, I think Furtado is very much a scholar. He's not a modeler, he's a scholar, and he's very heavily informed by history, and history permeates across his work. And I think he's struggling to find a synthesis, and he keeps moving. His frame of thought keeps moving, and it moves in one direction and in another, and I don't think he ever settles down in one single model, but then most of us won't settle down. We'll continue to think. And I think he commits himself increasingly throughout his life to an interdisciplinary perspective, to a rich, historically informed interdisciplinary perspective on problems of economic development. And he realizes the difficulty to develop a country like Brazil or any other Latin American country is not an issue of pumping up economic growth just. It's a social issue, it's a historical issue, it's a problem of social relations, and he toys with this from different perspectives. He's also a homegrown scholar and a genius who sees the emergence of his own approach to economics and to economic development in relative isolation from the Anglo-Saxon academia. He's not someone who was immersed in a big university throughout his academic career, as most of us are. He thinks these things through for himself to a very, very large extent. And this is to his credit, that he arrives through a combination of reading, thinking, data analysis, etc. He arrives at these floating and shifting syntheses of what he sees as the fundamental problems of development. And he confesses to being wrong. Several times he says, I was wrong. So let me try again. And then he tries again from a different perspective. And that is part of the richness of thought. So there won't be a school of thought named after Furtado, but there will be lots of thinkers inspired by different aspects of his thought, inspired by different pieces that he wrote. And he wrote things that were criticized as well. And in the critique, there is value too. But what a powerhouse, what an intellectual powerhouse this man was. And it's a real privilege to come across his work. And when I was studying economics, we studied his book and we studied other pieces that he had written many years previously, and it was illuminating back then, continues to be illuminating now. So for us, it was a real pleasure to view those working papers and to bring them to light through Rope. So thank you so much for the opportunity, Louis-Philippe, and for this session as well.
Well, I am very happy to have published these papers. As you know, I was a big fan from the beginning, and I recognized immediately the importance of getting those papers out. And I'm glad that they are out now in the current issue of the Review of Political Economy. We come to an end. I want to thank my three guests, Fernando Rugitsky, Pedro Loureiro, and Alfredo Saad-Filho for their presentations. I thank everyone who participated, those who asked questions. And well, that's it. I just want to say, wherever you are in the world, I hope you stay safe, you stay healthy. And there is a little something happening in the United States today, not as important as this webinar, but in 23 minutes, Amitabha must be happy with what's happening. And I want to say Happy New Year to everyone, and we'll see you back here and in the journal. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.